Okay, hello, friends. So, thank you so much for your interest in my project. So, I'm recording this presentation in my dorm room once again because I failed to do that properly during my presentation. So, it'll be a little bit, I suppose, different without the audience, but please bear with me if there's some awkwardness in this presentation. So, I begin with a kind of a personal question. It is not the main question of this presentation, but it is what prompted me to engage this subject matter that I will get into in a minute. But the question is, how shall I do academic religious philosophy? So, as my friends know, I finished my dissertation on Kierkegaard in 2009, and I taught philosophy for a while, for a few years, and then I took a break due to several circumstances, and I decided to work on my salvation. And I took several years as a kind of a wandering monk, self-styled monastic life. And it was a really rich time spiritually. And I didn't know that I was going to come back to the academic life again. But as you know my story, I wanted to become a pastor. And so went to seminary and began to pastor a church together with other pastors. And but then the Lord really called me back to the academic life again. And so it's fitting that I should pick up where I left off on Kierkegaard scholarship. But this question was sort of a burning question on my mind because I couldn't do philosophy professionally in the same way as I was able to in my 20s. Now that I am more spiritually oriented, you might say, the sort of typical academic philosophical literature that gets written, much of it is something that I do not desire to engage in any longer. It doesn't bring me any kind of enjoyment or joy to engage in it. So it was a kind of a dilemma. And so I looked to Merrill Westphal, and I found this article called Prolegomena to Any Future Philosophy of Religion That Will Be Able to Come Forth as Prophecy. That was a mouthful. But in it, he basically challenges the typical presupposition that philosophy must be scientific. And so if you look at the 20th century analytic philosophy, certainly that philosophical approach is based on the scientific method. And then also the early 20th century continental philosophy, culminating in Edmund Husserl, that is also based on the model of science. And Westphal goes on to mention late Wittgenstein and Heidegger's existential phenomenology as a sort of handwriting on the wall, what is to come, what this sort of scientific method-based philosophy gets us to. So late Wittgenstein leads us to Richard Rorty, the pragmatist and relativist for many in the analytic philosophical tradition. And then we have Derrida as the heir of continental philosophy. And these would be characterized as sophists, according to Westphal's assessment. And therefore, scientifically based philosophy leads to sophism, basically. And then Westphal mentions Husserl's famous lecture called Philosophy and the Crisis of European Humanity. And the trouble with a kind of a spiritual sickness that the European civilization was beginning to experience was already articulated. And so I want to read that first quote from Westphal's article. If a crisis in philosophy exists, it is its total incapacity to come forth as spiritual medicine. The health of our civilization is nothing other than the health of our science. So this was the assessment of Husserl. But Westphal begs to differ. And he says, he points to the fact that our civilization has its roots in biblical religion as well. So he proposes that at least the philosophy of religion should be done on a different model, not a scientific model, but rather the prophetic model, what he calls a prophetic model, based on the Hebrew prophet. And he identifies four characteristics of what is to be considered prophetic. Number one, personal, as opposed to abstract and universal, as scientific method prizes. And then secondly, the prophetic has an untimely characteristic. And then third, the prophetic is engaged politically. And then the fourth, the prophetic is also eschatological. So I'm going to read the second quote. The author is not a transcendental ego, nor his reader a non-participating spectator. Rather, Kierkegaard has sought to hear God's truth in a personal way and then pass it on, albeit without authority, meaning without religious authority. He was not a pastor, in an equally personal way. So Westphal sees Kierkegaard as a paragon of the sort of prophetic religious philosophy. And so this article has presented me with some challenges. Number one, there is a personal challenge. Kierkegaard was, if he was a prophetic philosopher of religion, then he was one that raised the moral rigor to a very high degree. And there was no separation between what he communicated through his writings and also his personal life. So that is a personal moral challenge. Let's set that aside. But then there is also a conceptual challenge concerning his what is called indirect communication. So, for those of us who are well familiar with Kierkegaard's authorship as a whole, there is a kind of a first period where he wrote in a very different way than most philosophies are written, namely that he wrote poetically, so to speak. He calls it his aesthetic writings. And he used these pseudonyms to write certain life views, certain life attitudes, and they were authors themselves. And so he created these authorial characters to speak about some topics, of course, religious and ethical topics. And so he had the conviction that when it comes to ethical and religious subject matter, you could not simply use so-called direct communication. You could not treat it like it's a scientific topic or some kind of a scientific or scholarly subject matter, but rather you had to use a different method, this indirect method. However, in the second period of his writing, he uses much more direct communication. And therefore, this discrepancy where the first part of his writing is mostly pseudonymous and the aesthetic writing, and then the second, he uses direct communication method. So this seems to create some inconsistency, apparent inconsistency. So Kierkegaard, this is a very well-known problem among Kierkegaard readers and commentators, and many have sought to try to explain it. And so I give you some samples of responses from contemporary Kierkegaard scholarship. So there's one response that says that Kierkegaard's early conviction was abandoned in his later authorship, where he addresses the religious matters directly, culminating in his really a vicious personal attack against the church, against the Danish Christendom. And here is a representation, a representative of the view that says Kierkegaard is being inconsistent. So it says Daniel Berthold. He says Kierkegaard, the man's eventual giving in to the very human impulse to be understood cannot be reconciled with Kierkegaard, the author. To accept the authoritative role of the author invoked in the point of view by which Kierkegaard imposes a legitimate meaning upon his work is in fact to delegitimize the ethical practice of the previous authorship. So in other words, Kierkegaard wrote this book the point of view for my work as an author, it was kind of a big reveal to say what his authorship, especially in his earlier authorship, where he used all these pseudonyms, wrote philosophically with humor and irony, and with all these pseudonyms, and that would have been puzzling to his readership if they didn't really know what he was doing. And so, in this big reveal, the point of view, he basically gives an overall meaning to his authorship, saying that all along the point was religious, to raise spiritual awareness and cause perhaps a spiritual awakening in his readers. So, according to this author, Berthold, this is illegitimate. He basically is being inconsistent with his earlier conviction about writing and about how to communicate ethical and religious content, where Kierkegaard will say, for example, in these two quotes over here, I myself have from the first clearly asserted and again repeated that I am without authority, in the point of view, page 12. And then in one of his major works, Concluding Unscientific Postscript, he uses a pseudonym called the Johannes Climacus, and he says that the author is superfluous, quote unquote. Let no one therefore take the pains to appeal to it as an authority, for he who thus appeals to it has, eo ipso, misunderstood it. To be an authority is far too burdensome. So Berthold brings these quotes to bear on the idea that the Kierkegaard held to earlier, saying that his later conviction, where he reveals his intention, the authorial intent, and also directly addresses the religious ideas and also attacks the church, is inconsistent. Okay, so that's one view. And then the second view says that the Kierkegaard is being consistent. He's always had this concern for religious spiritual awakening. So he attacked the Danish Christendom, this idea that everyone is a Christian, born a Christian. This is something cultural rather than is something that the individual makes a choice and commits to throughout one's own life, whole life. So the other side likes to emphasize consistency in the content of Kierkegaard's writings, but not, but acknowledging that the form in which he communicates this content, the same content, has changed, has evolved from early to late writing. So the author is David Law. In his article Irony in the Moment and the Moment in Irony, he writes this: For Kierkegaard, then, there appears to be no discontinuity between the authorship and the attack, but only in the mode of the attack, which has moved from being indirect to direct. So that's an acknowledgement that the mode of the communication has changed from being indirect to direct, while the content of his communication, the subject matter, has always remained the same. And the second quote, he says, "It is thus a mistake to see the attack on Christendom as an aberration. The points of contact between the concept of irony and the moment and the late writings." So the concept of irony is the earliest writing that Kierkegaard gave, and that is, in fact, his doctoral dissertation. And then the moment and the late writings refers to the very late writings just before he died, where he goes on just explicit and vicious attack against the Danish church, saying that the people should stop going to church. And even he attacks the institution of marriage itself, which troubles many readers. Anyways, so David Law is trying to say that there are points of contact between the earliest and then the latest writings, which indicate an underlying consistency between those two early and late works, and therefore demonstrates the continuity of thought running through Kierkegaard's entire literary production. So I'm looking at the situation, and the first take on this discrepancy seems to me to be rather wrongheaded, because it does not. It is very selective and partial in its perspective. I think if we understand Kierkegaard's theory of communication comprehensively, I think we should be able to see the consistency, and that is what I'm going to try to demonstrate. But the second approach, where it emphasizes the consistency of content, but yielding to the fact that there is discontinuity of the mode of communication from being indirect to direct. That view is also dissatisfying because while it is true that the content remains the same, that the fact that the form of communication changed from being indirect to direct is very significant because of the kind of philosopher that Kierkegaard was. He gave just studious attention to the way in which the content is communicated, and therefore, for Kierkegaard to change so dramatically from one form of communication to another must be explained. So it is not enough to say that the content remains the same when in fact the difference in the form must be explained as well. So that is what I'm going to try to do with my theoretical construction of Kierkegaard's concept of indirect communication. And it's just this sort of responses, these two different responses really call for a comprehensive, thoroughgoing construction of the theory, Kierkegaard's theory of communication in general, and in particular, his theory of indirect communication. So that's the kind of the starting point. And here are the sources that I used to construct Kierkegaard's theory of indirect communication. And these are laid out roughly in chronological order. So, Concluding Unscientific Postscript to Philosophical Fragments was written in 1846 by the pseudonym called Johannes Climacus. And then there is the point of view for my work as an author. Now, this was actually published after his death in 1855. It was posthumously published in 1859, but in his journals, he wrote that it was as good as finished in 1848. So this would be the second sort of complete thought on this theory of communication that we need to take a look at. And then the third most important work that we need to look at is called Practice in Christianity, written by the pseudonym called Anti-Climacus, written in 1850. And then there are many journal entries that were not published, and he had no intention of publishing, but that were posthumously published. And he also knew that all these journals would be published after his death. And the particular interest is there is a unpublished rough draft of a series of lecture notes. He was going to title it "The Dialectic of Ethical and Ethical Religious Communication." It was never finished, but there is actually a serious amount of writing, a pretty substantive amount of writing that is there, and therefore Kierkegaard scholars often go there to sort of mine his understanding of communication. But there are lots of sort of scattered thoughts that are found in his journal that are collected under the name Communication in Volume 1 of the Journals and Papers translated by Howard and Edna Hong. And then there's Volume 2, where there are also some significant extracts or entries under indirect communication. And so those are going to be my sources for constructing this comprehensive theory of communication. So let's go to the Climacus theory from Postscript, Concluding Unscientific Postscript. In one sentence, I would summarize this theory in the following way. Irony necessitates indirect communication. So let me just read my thesis summary of the theory portrayed in Concluding Unscientific Postscript. When the subject matter of a discourse is ethical or ethical religious in its nature, and its proper aim is to understand and appropriate that subject matter, namely to realize the infinite moral ideal in one's own existence, which Kierkegaard called the God relation. The mode of communication cannot be direct in general without, quote unquote, deception. That is, without failing to ironically bring about an inappropriate mismatch between the communication's content and its form. Therefore, it must be indirect. It must deceive in another sense to preserve the proper relationship between the communication's form and content. Okay, so let me just try to explain what that means. So let's go to the first quote from Concluding Unscientific Postscript. Climacus says, whereas objective thinking invests everything in the result and assists all humankind to cheat by copying and reeling off the results in answers, subjective thinking invests everything in the process of becoming and omits the result, partly because this belongs to him, since he possesses the way, partly because he, as existing, is continually in the process of becoming, as is every human being who has not permitted himself to be tricked into becoming objective, into inhumanly becoming speculative thought. There are many other important passages that I could quote, but just to summarize, what Climacus is trying to get at is that there is a kind of ontological irony about human existence, human self. And this is the famous idea expressed in later work called Sickness unto Death, where Kierkegaard famously difficultly defines human self as a synthesis of the infinite and the finite. In other words, there is an infinite or eternal aspect of the human self, and then there is the finite. You could sort of describe it in terms of the duality of body and soul. Body, we have this animal body, which is finite because we are in finite space and finite time. And there's also limits to what this body can do. But also there is an infinite side to us by virtue of our rational capacity and moral capacity, namely that we are aware of the divine and we are aware of eternity. And you might say, according to Schleiermacher, that would be God consciousness. And Kierkegaard calls this God relation. So there is this sort of, Kierkegaard calls contradictory, right? One is infinite, the other is finite. So there is a sense in which these don't, there's a kind of inherent mismatch between them. Because of this ontological state of humanity, this very unique ontological state, the ethical discourse must match this incongruity in the human self. In other words, ethical religious discourse should be aware of the subject matter's infinite nature. So if the communicator is talking about some moral truth, because the moral truth is always infinite in nature, because it is really our God relationship, the form of the communication must also conform to that. And therefore, it has to be indirect. You cannot directly state what that ethical demand is, what that good is with a capital G, right? What God is. So just as God is infinite and therefore cannot be described in finite language, finite words, right? Apple, that's a finite word that can refer to some finite objects, and that word does just fine. But then the word good, or however you refer to it, if you do it in an indirect manner, in a direct manner, then it simply won't capture it. So you cannot use, a philosophical discourse like premise, conclusion to describe this ethical reality. that would just be an incredibly ironic mismatch between the form of communication and the content. So an indirect approach must be used. So that's one sense in which the ontologically ironic state of human self requires indirect communication. But there's also another sense, namely that because the infinite, the God consciousness, is always present in the human self, it always is going to have a kind of negative, negating effect. In other words, it would always seek to challenge to overcome the sort of finite understanding and finite realization of that infinite moral ideal. And therefore, Kierkegaard always likes to talk about this idea of being in the process of becoming. In other words, morality is true only if is in a continual striving. And therefore, to present moral life as if it's finished product, like again, in an argument form, right? Premise, conclusion, in a kind of a deductive argument form, it is utterly absurd. It is utterly incongruous to the nature of morality. So, direct communication is wrong form of communication for ethical and religious subject matters because it falsely communicates that ethical and religious content is a finite matter. Second quote, he is, so the person who would communicate ethical or religious subject matter is therefore never a teacher, but a learner. And if he is continually just as negative as positive, he is continually striving. So negative, again, that's the infinite's sort of relationship to the finite, and therefore whatever finite moral achievement you gain, the infinite is always present to negate it. And so there is a kind of a dialectical dynamic movement between some sort of positive moral achievement and then the negative sort of nullifying that in order to strive even further. Okay, so that should be the proper form in which the moral life should take, and therefore the communication should also take on that character. And so also this ontological ironical state makes all human beings equally knowledgeable and capable of achieving moral good, this morally good life, essentially. So there is really no teacher versus learner. Now, this is something that Socrates clearly understood according to Plato's dialogues, and therefore he's always pretending to be ignorant and then seeking to learn from other people, where it turns out that the people who are supposed to know or be experts in all these matters of justice and courage and so on and so forth end up showing their ignorance, right? So, but the fact that there is no teacher and learner fundamentally shows is supported by the fact that or Kierkegaard's observation and also his Christian theological understanding that we're all made in God's image, and therefore there is God consciousness in us. We are aware of that infinite moral demand equally, and also therefore we are also morally capable equally of attaining to that ideal. At this point, Kierkegaard won't talk about the doctrine of sin, which of course makes us all equally incapable of achieving that moral ideal. But regardless, at this point, Kierkegaard simply is trying to prove why indirect communication must be used when